Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Brainbean here again. Today we're going to be doing a revival of an older series that I used to do on this channel called Switches Best. It was typically a comparison between different types of mechanical switches, and we talk about the pros and cons or what makes one better than the other. And because Logitech just put out their new GL switches and I wasn't able to compare all of them in my review of the G915, I thought this is the perfect opportunity to break down all the different switch types for you and show you what they have to offer. So with that, let's go ahead and check out these switches. So starting off by just talking about what these switches are. So Logitech's new GL switch is a low profile mechanical keyboard switch that's available in their new G915 and G815 low profile mechanical keyboards. Now these were made in partnership with Kale, and so they are a mixture of the Kaihua chocolate switch and Logitech's own specifications to create the GL switch. Now all three switches actually have identical specs, and it is available in a clicky version, a tactile and linear variant, so there's something there for just about everybody. And the actual specs on these switches is a 1.5 millimeter actuation distance, which I really like. I think it's kind of the sweet spot for gaming, which is not too fast for typing, but it's not as slow as something like a Cherry MX Red or Brown with a little bit longer key press. And then the overall total travel distance is 2.7 millimeters, which is a nice distance for a actual press because, you know, sometimes these low profile keyboards have like super short presses, and it does feel more like a low profile keyboard. Whereas with these GL switches, I feel like when you really type on them, they feel more like full-size mechanical switches than they do low profile. Now they all have a 50 gram actuation force, so universally they should feel pretty natural. But let's talk about the actual typing experience of each switch type. So starting with the clicky switches, now these things are super pronounced. They have a really crisp tactile click to them that's very snappy, and not only does it give you a pretty substantial tactile feedback, but it's also got a nice audible feedback as actually one of the louder clicky switches that I've tried. As for the tactile variant, you're going to notice a little bit heavier tactile bump here than you would on something like a Cherry MX Brown switch. And I actually put the two side by side in my testing, and while the Cherry MX Brown has that sort of rounded out bump to it that feels almost like a linear switch with just a little bit of tactile snag there as you go over that actuation point, the GL switches really have a nice pronounced tactile bump to them that you will have to actively push through to be able to actuate that. So if you like a good crisp tactile feel to your switches, the GL Browns are really nice. And lastly, as for the linear switches, I feel like these have a sort of velvety feel to them. The reason I use that to describe it is it almost has this sort of smooth friction feeling as you press down the key. It doesn't feel like it's something that's overly dragging, but there is this sort of smooth contact feeling, almost like running your hand over velvet or something like that. But overall, it's a nice, buttery, smooth press, and I think having that tiny bit of friction resistance actually feels pretty nice in the key press. Now, of course, with this being a switch video, I want to give you guys a good lengthy sound test. So I'm going to give you a sound test of all three switches, and we'll mash them all together here and there too, so you can get a really good idea of how these compare. And no matter which one of these switches you pick, you're going to get a really nice rock solid typing experience because of that Kaihua chalk design. Having that big rectangular stem that comes out kind of acts like a box switch, which really reduces the key wobble. And when you combine that with just the lower travel and actuation distance on these things, gives it a lower center of gravity, if you will, so there's not as much to wobble around. Really makes these feel just rock solid and a great typing experience overall. The GL switch is not a perfect switch, of course, because it does use a proprietary keycap design, and so it does not have the benefit of being able to go out and just buy a Cherry MX compatible keycap set and throw it on the keyboard. Now, for those of you that have been with Logitech for a while, you're used to the Roamer G switch. This was also the case with that. So you've been living in that boat for a while, you're probably used to it, but you should keep this in mind, especially with the popularity of custom keycap sets being more and more available on the market these days. Now, lastly, I want to give you guys a couple of personal recommendations if you're not sure which type of switch might be best for you or the applications that you're using, but I want you to take these with a grain of salt because I firmly believe that switch type choice really is all about personal preference, and there really is no perfect switch for any one thing. I think if you like the way something feels, then go with that no matter what you're actually doing with the switch. That being said, if you are looking for some recommendations, when it comes to the Clicky Switch, I highly recommend it for people that do a bunch of typing, really like that crisp tactile feel to it. Also, MMO gaming or MOBA gaming or something like this is a really good application for it. It's not as good for something like first-person shooters or action games, something where you like a nice smooth key press to just feel a little bit more fluid. And also, I really don't recommend Clicky Switches, especially the GL ones for streamers, because it can get really loud and you'll have to noise gate your mic, and if you don't do that, it's really annoying to your viewers, so that's definitely something to keep in mind. As for the tactile option, this is always my personal favorite. I think it splits the difference between the clicky tactile and the linear switches nicely, and it's a very versatile and well-rounded key switch type. It's great for MMOs or MOBAs or things where you're going to be casting abilities. And being able to have the tactile feedback there is a nice way to give you a little bit more confirmation that you did activate and press that key, and that's something that you won't get with a linear switch. It's also great for typing as well. You really just don't get the audible click that you would with a clicky switch. It's also a little bit less snappy, but the tactile GLs do have a nice pronounced tactile feel to them. But I think that switch type is still good for playing games like Apex Legends or PUBG because it's still fluid enough to still feel great when you're using it. And lastly, for the linear switches, I really recommend these more, like I said, for action type games or if you're playing racing games with your mouse and keyboard, especially if you play solely FPS games. I think the linear switches will give you a much more fluid feel to them. But I don't necessarily recommend linear switches for people that do a lot of typing because it does take some getting used to, and unless you bottom these out, it's weird and kind of hard to know when you really actuate the key press. For streamers, I definitely would recommend you guys lean a little bit more towards the tactile or the linear options, again, just for the noise. Well, that's it for the quick switch comparison, guys. Like I mentioned, these switches are available in the new G915 and G815 keyboards from Logitech. I'll have links down in the description below for you guys if you want to check out these keyboards a little bit more, as well as my full-length in-depth review of the G915 if you want to just learn everything there is to know about the keyboard. I'd like to ask you guys down in the comments below, let me know which one of these switches would be your favorite. And of course, if you guys enjoyed this video, give it a like to show your support. If you're new here on the channel, I'd love to see you subscribe. And as always, guys, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.